Well, we would like to welcome a first-time guest. That's joining us for the Sharpen podcast. Really glad to have with us this morning. Type 5 on the Enneagram, and more than that, we're going to learn more to that story. Scott Quigley, first of all, welcome to the Sharpen podcast.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here. It should be fun.
Yeah, we connected on some mutual places in Noblesville and Indianapolis, and that's a whole lot of fun. Tell us a little bit more, though. There's more to the story than that. So tell us about who you are, Scott.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So like you said, my name's Scott Quigley. I've pretty much grown up in Indiana and central Indiana my whole life, and have been going to the same church as such. It's been a pretty activistic church, and so the idea of serving and being in service has always been there in my life, throughout high school and college, and went to college in Washington, D.C. at American University, and from there got a degree in anthropology and archeology with an Arab studies minor. And so people have always been a fascination, as well as history as well. And so after college, I worked for an archeology firm, which was a lot of fun. There's a lot of heady intellectual types there. And so learning that and getting used to that as my first major work environment was fun. And then realizing that not every work environment is like that, where everyone just likes to sit around and talk about these bigger thoughts or that sort of thing, was a change. So after that, moved to a ski town in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and lived the ski bum life for about a year, which was a blast, just getting to wake up and go snowboarding every day. Finally moved back to Indianapolis to be closer to family. My sister and my brother-in-law started having kids. So I have two nephews and a niece that are just a blast to be around. And yeah, then I started at a Christian nonprofit that's got a lot of connections to Edge Mentoring, who, I know that you're connected to that. And then from there got hired on at Grace Church when they were looking to expand their leadership development programs about 4.5 years ago. And so that's everything to do with intern programs, residencies, staff development, congregational development, and then just some of these bigger things about HR and, developing cultures and using and utilizing tools such as the Enneagram to help people get better. And then also just learn more about themselves and their callings and that sort of thing. So it's been a lot of fun. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. You have such a unique background there. I'm imagining that being in Indianapolis, you start to miss the ski slopes and being able to snowboard occasionally, right?
Yeah, I've still got my snowboard in my closet and I still haven't had a chance to use it. It's just sitting there kind of mocking me.
Yeah.
But someday I think I'll probably go back.
Yeah, you could have a pretend session with your nieces and nephews too. That would probably.
Oh yeah, they would love it. Just traipsing around in the boots.
That's right. That's right.
That's funny.
Well, such a fascinating, interesting background. I'm so eager to hear more about your work with the Enneagram. So tell us a little bit. We know that you're a Type 5. This is the first time you and I've met, so this is really fun to get to even just meet each other and instantly get to kind of dive into a deeper conversation. Tell us about the Type 5. We've had a brief introduction with Drew, as you know, on our first episode, but tell us a little bit more about the Type 5 and how you do, okay, I think this is the one that resonates with me the most.
Sure. Yeah, Drew did a great job of overviewing the Type 5, but you'll hear some different names for them. They're either called the investigator, or I've also heard the wise person, which I don't necessarily think they hold all the wisdom when it comes to the Enneagram. So I like the investigator, but yeah, they tend to ask a lot of questions. They look to gather a lot of facts. They engage in that way. They fit into this past orientation. So a lot of the way that they try to work through the rest of the world is based off of either what they've learned, what they've read, or what they've experienced. So they've very much bought into the phrasing of if those that don't learn from history are bound to repeat it. That's pretty much like a 5's mantra for most of their life.
Okay.
They can tend to be a little bit withdrawn from others. They can be very much in their head, as their headspace is just they're one of the more thinking on the Enneagram, in that they just spend a lot of time in their headspace and almost sometimes have a separate world up in there that they can engage in. And they also seem to have almost an answer to everything, just because they do have that mental space where they do spend a lot of time. So they have thought about a lot of things. So it's like, well, you know, what about this topic? And they tend to be able to answer or have something about it simply just because they just spend a lot of time thinking. I had a conversation with a friend once who identifies as a 6, and we were talking about how much we think. And it kind of spun into this interesting thing where other people were like, well, like, what are you doing? Like, it's like, well, we're just sitting here, we're thinking, we're engaging, and like, we never thought about how much we actually thought on a regular basis, if that makes sense. But that was pretty interesting. So those in the head triad, which are your 5s, 6s, and 7s, do spend a lot of time in that space. And then how I learned about the Enneagram and being a 5, he's still very much, he was a boss of mine for the last couple of years, and then also is still very much my Enneagram teacher. His name's David Bell. He's located here in Indianapolis. But he introduced me to it when he was the associate pastor of our young adult community. So he used it in a cohort experience for people to get to know more about themselves and do self-awareness and self-discovery. And yeah, it was really helpful. But when you know, a lot of people, when they first get their result, they think, oh, this is horrifying. I don't really like this. It's kind of like, it's either shaming or makes you feel bad. And when I saw mine, I'm like, that totally makes sense. I don't get why anybody else would want to live otherwise. But it wasn't really for the gifting as much as like the brokenness in the 5, in that the idea of trying to protect yourself from others by holding on to information was on, you know, it's part of the gifting, but then also part of the brokenness for a 5. And really at the place that I was, really gravitated towards that because I thought that was true and the best way to operate in life. And frankly, over the last couple of years, have learned that it's really not, that this journey of being generous with yourself is what ultimately brings about the best in you as a 5. So at first, yeah, the 5 really resonated. I really enjoyed it, but then also realizing that sometimes the best part of ourselves that the world celebrates is often with the Enneagram rooted in our kind of deeper brokenness. Yeah, so that's been a journey trying to figure out who I actually am within that, but then also giving of myself in more ways than just my time, but also with my thoughts, my story, my experience, and especially emotions. Yeah.
Well, that is such a great background too of the 5. So for me, I took a lot of notes there on just 5s that I know and work with. So thanks for sharing that. I love that you brought up the framework of the Enneagram, and this goes back to kind of that initial conversation of why the Enneagram is so popular right now. And I think you really nailed it there with the gifting, as well as the brokenness in each type, because I don't know about you, Scott, but a lot of the personality assessments, for lack of better words, really focus on this is your gift and own it. And that's great, right? But you're also, whenever your buddy next to you is getting there, you know, I'm a woo on StrengthsFinder, and you're like, yeah, you are. And sometimes it has negative side effects. So I love that the Enneagram speaks to both of those, and you called that out for a 5. I think that's such a kind of helpful point and also why it's so popular. You've also gone a little bit deeper into, so it sounds like you were like, I've learned about the 5, this resonated with me, but you've done some additional work as far as using the framework to help other people. Why don't you tell us about that, and then kind of like why you we're so interested in kind of taking it a step farther, and then maybe even some of the discussions that take place at that group level, or maybe you do some individual work as well. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I've just found, like you said, the Enneagram is one of the only few tests out there that don't just celebrate your personality for its strengths, but also just reveals to you how sometimes they're wired into these deeper areas that often are the easiest ways to connect spiritually, as well as just do a lot of kind of soul level work. So the Enneagram's been really helpful for that, especially being in a church context. I mean, if you look at the history of the Enneagram over the last couple thousand years, it's been very ingrained in a lot of different secular, but then also religious organizations. And so their use of it has brought about really great spiritual engagement and soul level care. And so getting to do that within a church setting is really helpful. And we're, like I said, Grace is a very activistic church. So trying to get people out and into either the community or to wherever they're engaged. And part of that can be really helped by knowing about your spiritual gifts and the Enneagram to know just who and how you're wired. So in the midst of the staff, we've used it. I've done work on like communication styles within the Enneagram. So knowing how you present, how you talk, how you engage, kind of the strengths and challenges of that, and how it actually engages others is really cool. So we got to do that in a 2-part session with our staff. So it was, the Enneagram often gets used as like a self-awareness tool, but it can also be used as an awareness of others tool. And so that's where moving just beyond your number and starting to get a grasp of all of the numbers is very helpful. But it's not to be used in that way of like, well, you're this number and that's who you are, because like we've talked about, if you believe that the Enneagram reveals some of your deeper brokenness, when you call out that in somebody, all of a sudden you may be connecting with this deep brokenness that they've experienced, and almost in a very cavalier way, just reminding them of that. So that's even where like, oh, well, you could be this or that. Like, it's really, I mean, counterproductive. And if we're supposed to bring out the best in each other, it's almost like brandishing something very powerful in a way that, yeah, might just be very wounding or reminding of wounding for somebody. But yeah, on the staff side, so we've done a lot with communication, and then the Enneagram also can do a lot related to time orientation, which I know we talked a little bit about how this can be helpful in the workplace. So with the 5 specifically, we're past oriented. And so if you think about there's past, present, and future orientations, I had a boss for the longest time who was a 3. And so for him, he's future oriented. He's always looking forward, that sort of thing, high energy. And I'm looking towards the past. So we actually, until we really had some good conversation, butted heads a lot, because he thought I was kind of dragging things down, not really engaging his vision, really almost like kind of trying to shoot holes in it. What I was doing was trying to learn from what we had done in the past to make his vision more effective as we were, you know, moving forward in this ministry expression of interns and residents and that sort of thing. So in my mind, I was helping. In his mind, I looked like a giant stick in the mud. And that's, you know, for people who are moving and want to go, it can be very tough in that space. And so we had to have some good conversations, but we did some work, he and I, on the Enneagram in the midst of working with the staff that really was like, hey, when I ask these kind of questions as a 5, I'm not trying to kill your buzz or your energy or what you're moving towards. I'm just trying to make sure that I've got what I need so I can be fully on the team. Because when you get somebody like a 5 who's got all their questions answered and has the information they need, they're a great member of your team. But often because they have that initial, it almost feels like somebody throwing on the brakes, I guess. It can be very jarring for those of us who are like ready. We're like, hey, we're going to go, we're going to do this thing. It's going to be great. And then there's somebody who's doing like a Flintstones kind of car thing where they stick their feet in the ground and stop it all up.
That's a really, I've actually, Scott, I've never heard the time orientation piece of the Enneagram. That's the first time I'm hearing. Some of our listeners are probably thinking, well, yeah, you know, did you not read that one book or listen to that one podcast? Could you maybe briefly go through that is there a pattern as far as the types?
Yeah, absolutely.
3 is future. I'm going to put you on the spot now.
No, please. That's fine. So time orientation, there's a couple things within the Enneagram. First, there's what we call triads. So that's your head, heart, and gut triad. And that breaks around your 2s, 3s, and 4s fit into the heart triad, which tends to see the world through relationships. The head triad, which is 5, 6s, and 7s, tends to see the world through security and being essentially, you know, safe in what they're doing. And then the anger triad is viewing the world in terms of how they're doing or what they're doing. And so in the midst of that, so there are the 3 triads, and then the Enneagram breaks down into a lot of other 3s called stances. but that's essentially what time orientation is that the Enneagram breaks all 9 styles down into 3 different time orientations. So your 3s, 7s, and 8s are what are called your aggressive stance or future time orientation. And so that explains, 7s are planning for future adventure, 8s are planning what they're going to accomplish, and 3s are also doing, that sort of thing, but it's what I'm going to succeed at. Your 1s, 2s, and 6s are in your present time orientation. And so that's why they're really great at engaging some of these things that are around them. It's why 2s can see and feel the needs of others, because that's a very present engagement. 1s and 6s do that very similar thing, but for different reasons, and how they are just very engaging of tasks or what they're supposed to be doing, or of, just caring for others and engaging. And then your 4s, 5s, and 9s are in your present or in your past time orientation, but also the withdrawing stance. And so in the midst of that, they're tending to look to the past, either for 9s do it in terms of trying to forget, the reality of what's going on, or some of these things that they've felt wronged by. And then 4s do it by being very in touch with their emotions and engaging that way. And then 5s do it in their thoughts and thinking. And so in the midst of that, if like, man, I really butt heads with this coworker of mine, they just keep focusing on all of these things that are happening right now and kind of the needs of people, which is great if you're in a setting like that's trying to care for something. But if you're trying to plan for, a future event or something like that, and somebody keeps getting stuck in the needs of the now, you may have 2 different time orientations that are kind of putting you at odds. And so having an awareness of these, especially in the workplace, can be really helpful in like, hey, like Scott, we're trying to plan this future event, what have we done? So I can be engaged well as a 5. Hey, what have we done well that's worked with other events in the past? And I could go for days talking about that. And so then, but my part in that as a 5 is to say, okay, how do these past events translate into the goals that we're trying to do in the future, or this event that we're trying to plan, or how do I connect with these people so that way I can match their energy as they're looking towards the future and trying to plan these things? How do I engage them well in that? Because there's, if you believe in the idea of believing the best in each other, there's another part of that means that you have to move towards people and they need to move towards you in recognizing it. So it's sort of like the 5 love languages. Like just because we give in one way doesn't mean we also receive or other people give in that same way. And so we just need to take some time, learn about it, and engage each other well in that.
Yeah. Oh, that's
does that make sense on the time orientation?
Does.
Yeah,
it does. I hadn't really gone that far with the Enneagram types to understand that time stance or orientation. You bring up a great point about 5s are in that past, that past piece. And I think that's a really helpful note if you are working with a 5 or have a friendship or any type of, relationship there. What are some other helpful points? So you're a 5. And if you could say, here are the bullet points to know when you are working with me that allow me to thrive, allow me to be a part of the team in the best way. Like even the time, as you're telling me about that time orientation piece, Scott, I'm like, oh, that's so helpful. I think it's wise to have a group of people that ask questions in light of our past, in light of our present circumstances, in light of where we want to be in the future. If you get a whole room of the 9 types, you're in a pretty good position for that. But I digress. What are some of those, I guess, helpful points for working with a 5?
Yeah. One of the best things, and I know 5s are going to hate me for saying this because I'm revealing our secrets about how to get us to actually do stuff, because that's often a struggle for the withdrawing stance. So 4, 5s, and 9s struggle with doing repression. And so we can tend to live in our heads. So if you're working with a 5 or you have a 5 that works for you, asking the question of like, hey, show me what work you've done on this. Because I know that I've worked a ton on this, but it's all up here, and not in a crazy way, but like in an actual thinking way. Sure. I probably thought an entire project through, but if you ask me to turn something in, we're going to be in a different situation, because that's just not how 5s tend to operate. And again, that's more of a generality.
That's good.
And so asking a five, like, and helping them translate what's in their head, because, you know, at their best, fives are inventive, they're wise, and they're energetic because of the way that they operate. However, if they're not getting that out of their head, it's not actually helpful to anybody else. And so when you're working with a five or managing that, trying to help them translate what's in their head into practical pieces. So it's like, yeah, I know you've thought about the list of 300 caterers that we could ask. Have you asked them? Which again seems, you know, for anybody who's in that kind of, you know, doing preferred space, or just seems to do a lot easily, like that doesn't compute. It's like, how do you just not do things? And it's like, well, we each have our own, you know, area that we struggle with. So yeah, working with fives in that way can be really good. Also helping fives get in touch beyond just, because I think fives get, you know, pushed as like not being very emotional, and really in what it is there's a physical disconnect between a five's body and their emotions. And so helping them to actually display those, and that's part of the generosity piece. Like most fives are very even-keeled, deadpan. They seem to have great poker faces because there's, you know, it doesn't seem like there's not much going on here, but that's actually a way that fives hoard. Sort of their brokenness is to hold in those feelings and emotions. And so fives moving towards health, they do a lot more body expressions, facial expressions, that sort of thing, not only for themselves, but for others. So it's actually really good in the workplace for a five to get connected back with their body and emote in a way that other people don't just have to keep engaging or asking questions or guess how a five is feeling. That's a really great way to engage, and for fives to engage others as well, is how am I displaying this in my body? How am I sharing this with others in a way that's not just through my thoughts and my words, but you know, so much of human interaction is body language. And so how as fives can we help everybody else by actually sharing these things that we feel? One of my best friends is a four, and so, you know, for a while I'm like, I don't think I have many of these deep feelings that you do. And then we started to talk about it, and he's like, no, that's melancholy, that's despair, some of these deeper feelings, like you have them, you're just not being generous with them. And so that idea of being challenged in that has been really helpful to me, because then people aren't guessing as to how I'm feeling, or they don't have to probe. Yeah, but one thing my boss said about me, he's like, if you want to know how Scott's feeling, you have to ask him twice, because the first time he won't believe that you actually care, because fives struggle with trusting people with information. And so the second time, you know, he'll be like, oh, they actually do care, they want to engage, so I will share with them, which was super annoying when he shared that on a staff retreat, because then everyone was like, how are you doing? I'm like, yeah, I'm good. And they're like, no, Scott, how are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm going to kill my boss. But yeah, I mean, it's something that was very, I mean, it really shows fives have this innate distrust of sharing information and engaging people. And so that's something else of working with a five that can be really helpful, is how do I engage their trust and keep it? Because, you know, in my mind, I've got a list, and, you know, friends span both sides, but who do I trust and share information with, and who do I not share information with? And usually in my mind, they've earned it, of like, well, they've either blabbered about that or shared something that I didn't want them to. So there are a lot of people that I'm friends with and good friends with, but I don't share or trust them with certain things.
That's what I was going to ask you, is like, if that friend, like I don't want to assume, but for a five, like those deeper friendships are people that you have given information to routinely, time and time again, and it hasn't left, you know, the context of that relationship or that group of people. Is that like a big thing, like to build that trust? Is there anything else you would say as you think about those relationships?
No, that's a good question. So one of the things, and this goes to strengths finders, but one of my strengths is relator. And that's the idea that you want to go very deep with a few people. And that's actually been freeing for me because I've always had a smaller group of friends, but the ones that I do have are, I mean, they know everything about me and they see so much about me that most people don't. And so I've had that. A lot of those friends I've known since middle school. I mean, two of my best friends I've known since middle school, and we've been friends. We still work together, and it's really great. Cool. And we share a lot. And yeah, I mean, in that space, it's really good. But in more unhealthy parts of my life or unhealthy seasons, I've held on to that trust and tried to get people almost to feel like almost doing like an exercise of like telling them something to see if they can keep it. And if they don't, then they're off the list of people I can share with or trust. And that's not really a great thing. Fives are called to be generous at the risk and expense of their own safety and security. But like we talked about earlier, I bought into that brokenness piece of the five of like, well, yeah, of course I'm not going to share all this information with everybody because, or all of these deeper things about myself, because then it gives them control and power over me. And that's not necessarily the truth. And that's a very lonely life for a five if you constantly believe that everyone is going to use that power or control of information over you. Yeah,
that's good. That's helpful. That's just something to be extremely aware of in those relationships with a five. Also, one take home I heard, Scott, was that fives should play more poker. I mean,
oh yeah,
that's what I heard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my brother-in-law does like an annual poker game for his birthday every year, and it's a lot of fun, but it's very much that, you know, steel dead face that the fives can do.
Be honest, are you the best one?
You know, I do make it into the top three most times, but usually we've been playing for 4 or 5 hours at that point, and I'd rather go to bed because it's after, you know, my bedtime. So I would much rather go to bed.
Yeah. Well, this has no relevancy to the conversation, but I just think it's so cool that you have two really good friends from middle school that you work with today into adulthood. I can imagine that is so rare for someone to have that background and kind of know you throughout your life. That's especially as you think about, I grew up in a really, really small county, small town, rural America. And, you know, there's something really, really special about people who just know you and you've been around for a long period of time. I can imagine that's probably pretty cool now in the workplace with those friends.
Yeah, it is. And there's so much behind the idea of having like close friends at work that make your work and you just a healthier and better person.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's something very much to that, but then also not surrounding yourself with people who are almost like you in that same way. So my best friend's a 4. And then the other best friend I was talking about, they're both named David, which is funny, but he's a 2. And so we, in different ways, bring about so much in each other that's really good. I mean, if we really wanted to round it out in terms of like helping us be more motivated and accountable to doing things, because we're great at talking and feeling and thinking, but we all really struggle to get stuff done sometimes.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to, having a 3, 7, or 8 in the mix would be really good for us. And that's the other idea with the Enneagram. It's not necessarily to just hire all the same type of person or feel like one type is better than another. Often rounding things out is often the best thing. So in the same way that like a diverse group of people brings about better perspectives and the human experience rather than just all of the same. Yeah, the Enneagram is like that too. And on that note, one thing that's important like to note about the Enneagram is if you look at the couple thousand-year history of it, it wasn't until the last 50 years that people really started writing anything down with the Enneagram. It was pretty much always an oral tradition. And oral traditions require essentially 2 things: a group of people and the information to be shared. So for the vast majority of history and the way that a lot of people are getting the Enneagram wrong now is that it was never meant to be done on our own. It was always meant to be done in community. It was always meant to be done because people can call out things in you that, especially close people to you, that you would never notice yourself or recognize. And so, yes, reading, and again, don't get me wrong, I love to read and read on my own, But the best part of the Enneagram, and where I've gotten the most out of it, is by doing it in community with others. And so either getting to teach or facilitate, or even just having conversations and it becoming common language. And, you know, I'm fortunate to work at a church that it has become common language. We don't always get it right all the time, but in the midst of that, that communal aspect and that oral piece of it is what really helps people learn from it. And it and it's a lesson about the five too. Like, fives think having information makes them wise, but wisdom is knowledge and application. And so it's the actual using and doing of the information and knowledge that they've gained that is actual wisdom.
That's so good.
Just knowing things is, I mean, it's good, but it's not what we're called to as people, and especially as fives.
Yeah. Well, that an excellent call out. Excellent call out. And in Kentucky terms, Scott, we'd say, don't type other people. You know, it ain't cool. Don't do it.
Yep. I like that.
That's always one thing whenever friends are starting to get into it. I'm like, that's great. Just don't go around typing others. This has been so good, so helpful. I've been so thankful for your knowledge of the Enneagram. It's allowed us to take this conversation in some other directions today as well. We end every Sharpen episode. We ask our guests two questions. The first one would be, we would love for you to make a shout out to someone or a group of people. We think expressing appreciation and gratitude is such an important part of the work that we do.
Yeah. I guess I would like to make a shout out to my family, my parents, my sister, my brother-in-law. They've done a lot with the Enneagram over the last couple of years. And so that's been a lot of fun as a family to engage in that. And we all use it pretty well, but it's really helped us love each other in ways that really connect with us. So most of my family is either ones or threes. And so they're all like doing a lot. They're highly engaged, a lot of high energy. And then there's me as the five that's got reserved energy and just operate in that way. And so, yeah, even just them recognizing that I operate differently than them has been really redeeming and really engaging and within my family, which is a lot of fun. But yeah, that would be a group of people I'm connected to. That would be good. And then, do you want me to do the foundation thing?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So going back to the five, one of the things, a daily or weekly practice that's really good for a five to engage in is serving hands-on in the life of others. So for me, I found that by serving, my church has a food pantry that serves about 600 families every week. And so being there, serving hands-on with people, connecting with them emotionally, relationally, all of those things is really good soul work for me as a five. And in the last couple of years, the food pantry founded what's called the GCC Foundation, but it's the marketing and fundraising arm for the food pantry. And so I've gotten to be on the board for that since August. But we've just finished a capital campaign to raise about $650,000 to expand and double the capacity of the care center. So we're going to be able to serve about 1,200 families every single week in Central Indiana, which is amazing.
That's amazing.
And then also there's a lot of other aspects, including a thrift shop, that are really cool. And so now as a board, we're looking to what's next. What are we going to fundraise for? So if you're in Indianapolis or Hamilton County and looking for a place to serve or connect, we're starting to look at corporate partnerships as well. And so if there's, anything to do with that, I would love to connect, or you can connect with the board about that.
Awesome. Scott, we would love to include the links that you send over to us in the show notes as well, because we do have a lot of listeners in that Indianapolis area.
Okay. That's awesome.
Awesome. So be sure to, if you're listening, check out the links today for the GCC Foundation. We would also love to hear what's been a game changer for you, Scott. What's something that set your path in a little bit of a different direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm part of that group. I graduated college in 2011, so still in the midst of the recession. And so for some of us, the last couple of years have been hard getting into a place like essentially your first real job.
Yeah.
That was a pretty tough time, but I had people, 20, 30, 40 years older than me who wanted the best for me. And so my first job at a nonprofit in Indianapolis came out of a connection who pursued me essentially, even though fives deal with wanting to be competent. And so the idea of networking was I was trying to keep it on the back burner just because I wanted to prove that I could do this myself. And obviously that wasn't working. And this person kept pursuing me, and eventually, helped me land that first job that got me to this place that's propelling me on to where I am in the future. And so the idea of, looking back and pulling up that next generation, offering and being generous of your network, that was ultimately a huge game changer for me. Was somebody who ultimately never benefited from it, other than just knowing that they made a connection, helped me get to where I'm going and where I'm called to. That was ultimately a game changer. And then also choosing a different attitude for myself to actually engage in that. Again, huge piece, but that was, I would say, a game changer for me was accepting that, but then also, somebody who cared as much as they did for no other reason than they just wanted the best for me and to help me out. So if there's ever a chance to do that, I know sometimes a lot of us get a lot of network invites or people who just are trying to get access to things. But as somebody that really benefited from that, being generous in that space is a game changer for more than just ourselves.
Well, I've loved that the theme of generosity has surfaced today. That's such I think, a powerful theme as we talk about the type 5. So I just want to thank you for your time and for even going outside of a type 5 to share a little bit more about what you learned about the Enneagram. We've been so glad to have you on, Scott.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.